This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 499 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Fantasy baseball fans, FanDuel has a special contest running for you every single day. The FanDuel Home Run Challenge is free to play. All you have to do is draft a team of 3 players, and you'll receive points for each home run that they hit. Compete for a chance to win a part of the $10,000 prize pool. Head over to FanDuel and play the Home Run Challenge for free. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Today's a mailbag episode. Let's get to it. The first question this week is from @TubaGuy32478. Hi JJ, you rock. No, you rock, Tuba Guy. Was the James Conner trade good or bad for Chase Edmonds? Is the upside there? Can we envision a path to RB2 status for Chase Edmonds? So on an episode a few weeks back, I mentioned how I was selling Edmonds after Kenyon Drake signed with the Raiders, because a move like this one was inevitably going to happen. With that being said, I think a move like this is probably a good one for Edmonds, because if it was a given that they were going to add a piece of that backfield, adding a piece like Conner, who I think is more of a replacement level running back, that's far better than adding someone in the draft like Javonte Williams. Now the odds that they spend their limited draft capital on a running back is smaller. They may not get one until their round 5 pick, given they don't have round 3 or 4 picks. If that happens, then it's a good win for Edmonds. I don't think Edmonds is going to be some 220 carry running back though. He's a good pass catcher, but Edmonds is a little bit undersized, and he has just 2 career games with more than 11 rushes. You can say that he's never had competition in his backfield that's been this mediocre, and I generally agree with you. But he was still playing behind a bad David Johnson during Johnson's last year in Arizona, and I'm not sure Kenyon Drake is a special running back. What I think this move did was now Chase Edmonds' value is not completely torpedoed. I can see a path to RB2 status for sure, but I don't think that's really saying much. We really need RB1s in fantasy football if we want true difference makers. We need top 10 running backs. At least that's what I found through my research. I don't think Edmonds, just as a player, is going to offer that upside. And it's not because he can't catch, but because I'm not sure the volume on the ground will be there. And then you're competing for touches at the goal line with James Conner, who's a bigger bodied back who's capable of taking those touches, and then Kyler Murray as well. You know, last season, the Cardinals really opted to not use Chase Edmonds at the goal line. Kenyon Drake was tied for 3rd in the NFL on goal line rushes with 22, and Kyler Murray had 8. Chase Edmonds, he had 1. 1 goal line rush. That's a huge reason that Edmonds is still more of a floor play rather than a ceiling one. This next question is an email. It says, "Hello JJ, love your content, listen to all of it. Thanks. I think you have broached this in the past, but can you talk about which positions outside of tight end are more or less dependent on athletic testing when prospecting incoming rookies, and how you are dealing with that this year with no combine and pro day testing issues? Thanks, Dan." So I answered this one about a month or 2 ago, but I got the question a couple of times this week, so I figured that I'd talk about it a little bit more. From my research and what's in my model, athleticism testing doesn't matter that much at a high level. I say at a high level because I think there are instances where you subjectively may want to change how you view a player based on their testing. Like if there's a deep ball receiver who runs a 4.55 40, that's probably not the best sign in the world. The reason I think athleticism testing numbers don't seem to matter much is because there's so much already embedded into those numbers. It's very rare for a highly sought after prospect to test like a suburban dad. Because if that player is highly sought after, that means he was good and probably productive in college. And it's hard to be good without being athletic in some way. There's also a lot more to the wide receiver position. In order for a wide receiver to win and get the ball, a lot more needs to happen versus a running back seeing the ball. That's why I think we see running back combine measurables mattering a little bit more than at wide receiver. Or at least that's what I've found. But in the end, for a lot of these guys, I take a case by case aside from certain thresholds being hit. And I'll change things in my rankings based on the kind of player that I'm analyzing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. One thing I do hate, though, is that people that think the combine equals analytics. They think analytical and numbers-driven people are judging players strictly by the combine. That couldn't be further from the truth. If anything, I'd argue that teams weigh the combine more than numbers-driven analysts do. We see fast receivers being overdrafted in the NFL draft all the time. And that's the other thing, by the way. With these measurables, one of the reasons they may not matter as much for models that use draft capital is that draft capital is capturing everything. Like if a player runs a fast 40, maybe in some world that would have had some sort of signal. But that's probably going to boost a player's draft capital. So if draft capital is an input in the model, which it is in mine, then that means the 40 time itself is more relevant. This last question is from @DeepDiveDynasty. How do we view the Tampa Bay backfield now with Fournette re-signing and Bernard being added to the mix? Is this a situation to avoid, or is someone like Gio worth a late shot really late in redraft? I also got a lot of questions around this Tampa Bay backfield this week, including some questions about the whole ambiguous backfields thing. And those questions, by the way, about the ambiguous backfields, those are from the real ones. The ones who know all about how I like to target ambiguous backfields. So I appreciate that. Last offseason, I did a study on spotting breakout running backs. One of the main things that I found was that later round running backs who far outperformed their ADP, they were generally part of ambiguous backfields, or backfields where the starter wasn't selected very high in fantasy football drafts. That's what we're definitely running into with Tampa Bay. The Giovanni Bernard signing just made that backfield a disaster on paper. And from a projection standpoint, no one's really going to stand out as like a clear-cut high-end RB2 in fantasy football. But you target these backfields because we think we know more than we actually do. Things change. Situations change. Players get hurt. Players emerge. If there's one bet that I'd make on a player emerging this year in that backfield, it would have to be Leonard Fournette, given what he did in the playoffs. But whether I target him or not will depend on his ADP once everything settles. I don't think he'd be a bad value, though. He was kind of a nice best ball value before this Giovanni Bernard signing. And while Bernard may cap the receiving upside for Fournette, there's also a chance that Bernard is as irrelevant as LaShawn McCoy was for Tampa Bay last year. You have to just play the odds. This last question is from @SkinnyElvis. Sitting at 102 via trade in a Superflex start 2 tight end league, assuming Lawrence goes first, who is your pick? I'm good at quarterback with Jackson and Herbert, good at wide receiver with Juju, Moore, Metcalf, and Samuel, okay at tight end with Goddard and Tanyan, but thin at running back. Thanks. I think you can go in a lot of different directions here, and I also don't think it's possible to have an absolute locked-in answer right now before the draft. Like if Justin Fields goes to San Francisco, which by the way, I have zero sources, but I still think he's going to end up in San Francisco. But if Fields is a 49er, I think he's probably the 102 regardless of your quarterback situation. Because in Superflex Dynasty, quarterback is currency. Now, if we assume Mac Jones goes there and Fields doesn't have the same type of upside in a different environment, I may lean Kyle Pitts in this spot. I don't know how many teams are in your league, so I can't fully answer this with a ton of confidence. But in a start 2 tight end league, Pitts becomes a whole lot more valuable. And I feel better and more confident in Pitts as a prospect long term than a lot of the other players in this draft. It's just that he plays tight end, so he naturally falls a bit in rankings based on the position that he plays. But I think that you could even consider Najee Harris if you're thin at running back. I just think the better long-term solution is likely Pitts in a format like this. This last question says, hey JJ, love the show. Last year we saw the top 10 quarterbacks all score 340 plus fantasy points. The previous 5 years combined, there were 10 total that hit 340 points. We had a couple of high passing and rushing touchdown seasons that seemed out of the norm. Do you see this scoring output as an outlier or a trend? Yeah, I think I see it as a little bit of both. The reason I think this could be some sort of outlier is because the season that we just had was unlike any other season we've ever seen. Because of the pandemic. You had no fans. Opposing teams were able to control more at the line of scrimmage on offense than they otherwise would have been able to do. And then with the lack of preseason prep, offenses were at an advantage. They know what plays are being called. Defenses aren't as cohesive as a unit. That's why we saw so many overs hit at the beginning of the season. But there is some reason that these fantasy point totals are somewhat sustainable. Offensive holding calls were down this year. And the group of quarterbacks that we have across fantasy football at the high end, they're all dual threat quarterbacks. They're more dual threat than we've seen in the past. And as we know, a quarterback running the football well has always been a cheat code in fantasy football. So I'm sort of in the middle here. I don't think last year is the new norm, but I think our new norm is better than what we saw in 2019, 2018, and so on. Speaking of good quarterback play last year, this next question is from @JFlanman18. Should Josh Allen be considered a regression candidate? He was QB1 overall, and Drew Brees is the only quarterback in the last 10 years to repeat as QB1 the next year. I have Kyler on my dynasty team, but considering trading to trade for Allen to stack with Diggs. Torn on this decision. Okay, so one of the things I try to ignore is using a ranking from the previous season to justify some sort of stance. Only because the previous season could be nothing like the upcoming one. And injuries have already happened. Like when someone says, this player has finished as a top 20 running back for 4 straight seasons, he's got to be in the top 20 this year. I don't buy that. Because when we're projecting, we're working with perfect information. No injuries have happened. A stat like that one could just tell you that that player was healthy. That's it. That he didn't get hurt. But we've got to think about what being the QB1, or really the top player at any position, we've got to think about what that means. It means that player had an insanely good season. And when you have an insanely good season, you likely aren't going to repeat that season. It's just hard to. It's like anything else you do. If you go out and play a round of golf and you shoot 5 to 10 strokes better than you typically do, would you expect to do that again and again and again? Probably not. The thing with Josh Allen, though, is that historically QB1s would have these monster seasons because they very clearly had unsustainable touchdown rates. They were throwing touchdowns at a higher rate than they should have been, like Aaron Rodgers last year. Josh Allen's touchdown rate last year really wasn't that absurdly high. And if you look at his rushing numbers, he's been doing this now for 3 seasons. He's scored 8, 9, and 8 times over the last 3 years, and he's hit 420 or more rushing yards in each season. He's not as crazy efficient as he was during his rookie year, but as of today, probably over the next few years at least, Josh Allen will get it done on the ground. So as a result of that, he may not finish as a QB1 again this year, but that's not what rankings are about. You're looking at which player has the highest probability of doing that. And just because someone finished there during the previous season doesn't mean they won't or can't the next year. It's just that generally, there's reason that they won't. For Josh Allen, those reasons aren't as hard to overcome. So I think he's actually in a good spot. The last one this week is from @PortlandRippers. Can you do a deep dive into Antonio Gibson's situation? I hear people saying that Samuel is going to hurt his value and that his touchdowns will take a step back because they have a competent quarterback. I just feel that if Samuel hurts anyone's value, it's J.D. McKissic, and a good quarterback may set Gibson up for more touchdown opportunities. Am I wrong in thinking this? Thanks, man. Okay, so let's start with this Curtis Samuel narrative that's apparently a narrative. I'd agree that Samuel would hypothetically hurt J.D. McKissic more than he would hurt Antonio Gibson. But keep in mind that if McKissic is used the same way that he was used in 2020, then that's hurting Antonio Gibson. I know Gibson missed some time, but McKissic had a 19% target share last year in that offense. That's capping Gibson's receiving upside. Now, the hope is that Gibson, who played wide receiver in college, that he can build more into that receiving role in year 2. And I think that he will. But if Samuel is digging into McKissic, then there's at least some digging into Antonio Gibson by default. That's not really how I view these situations, though. That's not how I build projections. I'm just noting that McKissic last season was in the way of Antonio Gibson. And then I think and hope that that will change a little bit here in 2021. Now, your point about Fitzpatrick being in the picture now and allowing for more scoring opportunities, that's not wrong. That's not the wrong general idea. But there's an easy way to think about this. I hope everyone's ready for some fun math. I'm going to walk through an exercise, and I hope that you can really wrap your head around how to view this kind of thing. If a team scores more touchdowns, which Washington should with Ryan Fitzpatrick, then the players on that team have a higher chance to improve on their touchdown totals. So last season, Washington scored 34 times. That was one of the lower marks in the NFL. With Fitzpatrick, that might be closer to, say, 40. That's 6 additional touchdowns for players in that Washington offense. And maybe it's more. I'm just using this as an example. So someone may look at Gibson from last year and say, wow, he scored 11 times on the ground. That's great news. They're going to go from 34 touchdowns to 40 touchdowns. But that's not exactly how things work. Gibson scored at a pretty unsustainable rate last year. According to my method that looks at where each running back is getting his touches, Gibson's touchdown total should have been closer to 6 or 7 last year. So regression is coming. If everything stayed the same, I would expect Antonio Gibson to not come close to that touchdown total. And you can see that at the team level too. This is why I stress team level regression all the time. Washington had a pass to rush touchdown ratio last season of 0.89. They had more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns. That was the third lowest total in football. That's a number that generally regresses to the mean. And with Ryan Fitzpatrick now under center, we should expect that to regress to the mean. So let's just run through this simple exercise. Last season, Washington scores 34 touchdowns, and they have a 0.89 pass to rush touchdown ratio. They had 18 rushing touchdowns out of 34 total touchdowns. Now let's project them for 40 touchdowns this year. At that same pass to rush ratio, 40 total touchdowns would yield 21 rushing touchdowns. That's 3 more than last season. That would mean that Gibson would have a better chance to at least come close to last season's overinflated total. The problem is that ratio isn't likely to be the same. Let's say that ratio regresses to last year's average, which was around 1.8. At 40 total touchdowns, a pass to rush touchdown ratio of 1.8 would mean roughly 26 passing touchdowns to 14 rushing touchdowns. Now, all of a sudden, even though the team is better, even though they're scoring more touchdowns, those touchdowns aren't necessarily benefiting Antonio Gibson unless he's absolutely more involved as a receiver. And even then, you're likely not going to reach the same touchdown total because running backs don't score a lot of times through the air. This doesn't mean that Gibson will be a worse fantasy asset. If he's utilized more as a receiver, those receptions and those yards as a receiver can help him be less touchdown dependent in fantasy football. And I'd expect that from a player who's gone through the positional journey that Antonio Gibson has gone through the last couple of years. There's a reason that Gibson was a buy for me this offseason, because he has a lot of talent. He has a lot more to offer on a football field. But I hope this at least shows everyone how simplistic you can think about these situations year over year, and sort of how regression at the team level can impact a player's stat line. When we look at Antonio Gibson's 2021 outlook, what we should be hoping for is more usage on the receiving end because it's highly unlikely he's going to be able to sustain his touchdown production. And that's knowing that they're getting an upgrade at quarterback. That's knowing that they're likely going to score more touchdowns. And I think that can and will happen. I think that Antonio Gibson will be used more as a receiver because he's a talented pass catcher. It's something that we can project a little of, and then if the ceiling hits, all of a sudden we've got a strong fantasy football running back. So I'm in on Antonio Gibson. I just wouldn't make the assumption that with Ryan Fitzpatrick there, that all of a sudden Antonio Gibson's going to see even more scoring opportunities. I think Gibson's upside rests more on Gibson the player and his ability to be a bigger workhorse within that Washington offense. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And of course, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you next week.